Welcome to the Annenberg Space Photography's Iris Nights lecture series. My name is Olivia, and I'm delighted to be introducing tonight's speaker, Ryan Pyle. Before I begin, though, I wanted to acknowledge all of our guests watching via our live webcast on their computers or mobile devices. Ryan Pyle is an adventure television presenter, producer, and award-winning photographer. His career has spanned over a decade in some of the most exciting places on the planet. Ryan strives to shed light on the locations and situations that are often kept in the dark. Ryan is an award-winning photographer and has shot for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Newsweek, Fortune, and Time magazine. In 2010, he started enhancing his storytelling abilities by producing documentaries and adventure travel television programs that took place in some of the most remote parts of the world. Now, let's go to Ryan in our not-so-remote green room in the back, signing one of our filters. If you guys haven't been here before, we have a filter wall in the back. It's getting quite full now, so I'll have to go to like the middle. And we have all of our lecturers who come sign a filter. It's a nice little tradition we have, and we're very glad to include him in that. All right. Perfect fit. Great. Thank you. Welcome Ryan Pyle to the stage.
So thank you everyone for coming. I'd just like to thank the Annenberg Space for Photography for inviting me this week and getting a chance to talk to you about a special part of the world that I've been photographing for the last few years and have finally kind of built up enough work to produce my first book. And this image here is one that we'll start with and also see throughout. And let me kind of introduce myself a little bit more. I'm from Toronto, Canada, born and raised, if there's any Canadians here. It's good to see some familiar faces. But I've spent 14 years living in China. And I had a chance to visit this area, Chinese Turkestan, or Xinjiang province in China, on one of my first trips. And it kind of captivated me, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we continue. But here we've got a lady collecting dung, and she's collecting camel dung and sheep dung on the high plateau on the border with China and Kyrgyzstan. And for those people who might not know, Chinese Turkestan is the part of China that's known as Xinjiang province today. And this province is massive, China's largest province, I believe, and it borders on multiple countries, most of the stands. And so in documenting this area, I had a chance to visit some of the most remote places in China, where people live, you know, subsistence living, and where their lifestyle really hasn't changed in decades. So the title of my work is called Chinese Turkestan, a photographic journey through an ancient civilization. And it's all black and white photography, and all shot on black and white film with a film camera. Film, someone says in the front row. Yes, it's true. And my career hasn't been very long, and you know, there were digital cameras when I also started my career, and but really fell in love with film as a medium and black and white photography specifically. So this is how I wanted to paint this picture of this part of the world. I'm just going to play a brief video that'll give you a rundown of the body of work, and then we'll go back and look at many of the images through that video. So I'll just start now with that.
Allahu Ekber, Allahu Ekber. Allahu Ekber, Allahu Ekber.
So I always like to start with the video because what I'm about to tell you, I'm going to introduce a little bit about myself. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the part of the world that I've been photographing. And it's good if you already have a concept of the imagery and the landscape. So that's why I like to start with that. A little bit about myself. I consider myself to be a documentary photographer. I spend my life really trying to be invisible. I love street photography. I love capturing people in a natural environment, in a natural moment, using natural lighting, and when possible, using film. So that kind of process is just as important to me as the kind of subjects that I'm working with. And I've always kind of gravitated towards that as a way of really authentically telling a story. And I think that all photographers are storytellers. And, this happens to be, what I spent 8 years trying to communicate. I graduated from the University of Toronto in 2001. And this is quite a funny story because up until when I graduated university in 2001, I didn't have any interest in photography, which might shock you or might be sacrilegious to say in such a holy place. But I didn't have any interest in photography, and it is because I played Division I basketball in Canada, and I had no life. And and what happens when you have no life is you have no energy to try new things and to be creative. And it wasn't really until I left university and my career was over, where I picked up a camera and first traveled to China. And all of a sudden, this creative outlet started to kind of come over me, and this idea of storytelling and traveling really kind of grasped me. And China was very much my muse. I think that if I had stayed in Canada, I may have never picked up that camera and never had an interest really in documenting such a beautiful place. So I did my first trip in China in 2001 just as a backpacker. I went to China, backpack, camera, 90 days. I went all the way around the country. I didn't speak any Chinese. I didn't have any friends and went basically alone. And it gave me a real kind of opportunity to clear my mind and really kind of decide what I wanted to do as an adult now that I'd kind of completed school. And I decided that I wanted to photograph China on that 90-day trip. And I came home for Christmas in 2001 and gave my parents the Christmas gift that kept on giving. I told them I was going to move to China. And I moved there kind of in January of 2001 and began taking pictures, walking the streets of Shanghai, which is my home still today. I've lived there since 2002. And trying to kind of find my style, trying to find my voice, trying to understand, what the stories were I wanted to communicate. And then in 2005, I started becoming a regular New York Times contributor, and then moved on to also work with magazines like Time, Newsweek, and Fortune, and was named one of the 50 emerging photographers by PDN Magazine in 2009, which seems like a long time ago. And today I still live full-time in Shanghai, China. So that's my home, and I've come in just for this event today. So thank you again for all coming out. Here we've got a man. Just talk a little bit about the image here. Here we have a man in Kucha, which is in Xinjiang province, and I'll show you where that is on a map on another slide. And he's doing the call to prayer. Now, in a lot of parts of the Muslim world, they have recorders or speakers or sound systems with recorded voices that do the call to prayer. But every day, or especially on Fridays, which is when this one was done, Friday midday prayer, which is always the biggest, this man climbs to the top of the mosque, puts his hands together like this, and calls all the local villagers. And I just thought that was such a unique thing, because normally on a lot of my other trips in other parts of this region and other parts of the Middle East, you never see someone just standing on the top of a mosque screaming out to people, letting them know it's time to come and pray. So, just a quick map of China, just so we all understand our geography. Shanghai is in the eastern part of the country, where I live. And Xinjiang is the large northwestern province in orange. And the geography is very important. As photographers, as people who love to travel, we always are, we need to understand distance. We need to understand how long it takes us to get places, and logistics become very important. And it takes 5 hours for me to fly from Shanghai to the capital of Xinjiang, which is called Urumqi. So really, this entire project was just a 5-hour flight away, shorter than LA to New York. This is another map of Xinjiang province, that northwestern part of China. And you'll see Urumqi with the U, U-R-U-M-Q-I, that's the capital. And that's where a lot of my work done in that region up in the north. And then also Kashi, or Kashgar, which is on the left side of the image. That's the traditional kind of hub of Silk Road trade. And that's where I managed to do also a lot of my work, and in a lot of villages around there. And then also in the south, in Hotan, which is another really pretty spot. And I'll introduce all these images to you. But you can see the part that says Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and you see that there's no cities in there, because that's the Taklamakan Desert, second or third largest desert in the world, behind the Sahara Desert and the Gobi Desert. So it's a very inhospitable place. So people, you can see how the villages and the cities are around the outside of the desert, to give you a concept of what it is. So what is Chinese Turkestan? Xinjiang is China's largest province, and Xinjiang actually means new frontier. And the name began being used in the 1850s, and before that it was kind of known as Chinese Turkestan. Turkestan is a name that's been given to a wider region, which also includes parts of modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. And it's important that you understand that these images that I've taken, and in the book that I've created here, are all taken within the borders of China, modern-day China. So I didn't cross any international modern-day borders to get to any of the places where I did any of this photography. It's about 1.6 million square kilometers, 1/6 of China's total landmass, and the province, Xinjiang province, is 3 times the size of France. To give you an idea, there's 14 different ethnic groups in this region. And surprisingly, once I even found a small pocket of Mongolians living in a remote mountain valley, claiming to be descendants from one of Genghis Khan's advances across Western China and into the Central Asia. So you do find, again, this was the Silk Road. People were traveling back and forth all the time. There were interminglings, and people from all different kinds of races are mixed in, and you get some of the most incredible looking faces you could ever imagine. So it's absolutely heaven for a portrait photographer. The religion, the dominant religion in the region is Islam, and Xinjiang represents 40% of all the Muslims in China, and Uyghurs are Sunni Islam followers. And roughly has a population of about 26. Today, it's more like 30 million people. The Turkic Muslims, or the Uyghurs, are about 8 million of that. Ethnic Chinese are already a majority in the region. They weren't about 10 years ago, and part of that is causing some social friction, to say it nicely. And yes, like most parts of China, this region of Chinese Turkestan, or Xinjiang province, is also losing part of their cultural heritage to rapid economic development, which is just as true in my home in Shanghai as it is, 4,000 or 5,000 miles across the country in Kashgar. So here's an image, a typical Friday, and this man is buying a new jacket. So he's just come out of the Friday prayer at the main mosque in central Kashgar. And of course, the main prayer on Friday gets the most people, and it's the biggest volume prayer of the week. And there's a lot of people selling things when everyone comes out of the mosque, lots of women selling clothes, lots of people also begging. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But this kind of gives you an example of the kind of chaos or the kind of economic involvement or action after main prayer on Friday. It turns into a little market in front of the mosque. So a brief history of the region. As far back as the 1300s, most of Xinjiang province was actually Buddhist. Buddhism came from India through Xinjiang and then entered parts of eastern China and Tibet. And it wasn't really until about the 1600s that the region was introduced to Islam from the Middle East. In 1884, it actually became an official Chinese province. It was first kind of conquered by the Qing dynasty about 100 years before that. But as the Chinese empires grew in strength, they tend to conquer parts of Central Asia. And then as emperors lost strength, they began to retract their borders, and then Central Asia became very much no man's land. So they constantly expanded and retract that western border, which is why a lot of confusion has happened over the years about who actually really should be managing that part of the world. What else? Right, 1820s, the Chinese started actually sending Chinese people out to that region, Eastern Chinese people out to that region to try to assimilate the Muslim people. And this was very much a big thing in the Qing dynasty, and they sent even some officers, but also quite a few criminals as a way of kind of banishing them from eastern China. For a good 200 years, Xinjiang was really considered to be a buffer zone between Russia and China. And it was kind of a no man's land that no one wanted to really interfere with, because it kind of kept the Russians at bay, and that seemed to be quite, the policy for quite a while, which was good. And the question now today is whether it's a barren wasteland or a vital buffer. And this is what most of the province looks like. This is the Taklamakan Desert in the midday. And you can see the sand dunes and the way the wind kind of rips across the land. And it's completely inhospitable. The Taklamakan Desert doesn't have a rich tradition of camel-rearing people who do large kind of caravans across the desert the way you would find perhaps in the Sahara or something like that. So it really is kind of a large empty space with no life. Again, the history which we talked a little bit about, but one of the key issues now is that this century, and especially the last 15 years, 14 years, China's had a very big go west policy, meaning that the coastal places in Shanghai and Beijing are now developed. My home of Shanghai of 25 million people is now developed. And what they're trying to do is shift economic development west into the western parts of the country. And this area of Xinjiang, Chinese Turkestan, is a mineral-rich part of China. And what they're doing is they're pushing development out towards the west. And with that comes people who do mining, Eastern Chinese people who do mining and build roads. And because of that, new wealth is being created, and old laneways are being destroyed, and new high-rises are being built, train stations, airports. The exact same thing that's been happening all through China. And this obviously has both good and bad consequences, and we'll be looking at some of that. Here's a typical market scene, and you can see markets still play a very central role in this culture. They happen every day in various towns. And in a place like Kashgar, which is a very central hub for the region, Kashgar is surrounded by maybe 10 or 15 small villages, and each day certain villages have their own markets, and there's quite a lot of travelers who go from market to market to market. So you can find a scene like this literally every day of the week. And you can see the older woman walking through, avoiding the cow. You can see all the dust that's kicked up from the livestock that's being traded or sold. And you can see the men, and this kind of haze that exists in the region. And part of that is because in order to heat your home, you have to use either cow dung or camel dung, or you use coal. And of course, when you've got coal burning all night, you wake up in the early morning, which is when this picture was taken, and it's all hanging in the air, which is why you've got that kind of beautiful haze above. So this project specifically was really to try to document every aspect of life in Chinese Turkestan or Xinjiang, because the region is really changing. This wonderful part of the world is losing its culture, its architecture, and its traditional way of life. The ancient and mystic traditions of the Silk Road are on the verge of really disappearing. And I truly believe that. And when I first visited the region in 2001 as part of my backpacking trip, and exploration, I had a chance to visit this part of China and was mesmerized by it. And as I went back in 2003, 2004, and then to complete this project, I basically went 4 or 5 times a year for 8 years. The change was phenomenal, and the pace intensified and quickened. So as I began working on this project, things started to change even faster, and it kind of created this new sense of urgency to kind of continue doing this work, because I was really documenting something that I wouldn't think would still exist in 5 or 10 years as China races, to modernity. This is an elderly man in the town of Hotan, which is kind of in the southern part of Xinjiang. And he's a farmer. And to give you an example of some of these people's lives, he's in his 70s and still farms, but he farms in the summertime. And in the wintertime, he and his family, they all make carpets. So this portrait was taken in a carpet factory where they make carpets during the wintertime when it's too cold to farm. And I've got a funny story. I gave an exhibition in the UK a few years ago, and I had this picture blown up, and it was quite large. And I was kind of standing next to it at one moment, and this lady came up to me in Brighton, and she says, "Are you the grandson of the photographer?" And I said, "Really? No. I mean, I'm the photographer." And she goes, "Oh, but you know, these were taken in the 1920s, weren't they? Like, you know," and I kind of explained to her that all of these pictures had been taken between 2004 and 2012. And she was kind of amazed. And I think a lot of people ask me about my process and why did I choose to use film and why did I choose to use black and white. And I think as an artist and as a storyteller, we all have to kind of pick our palettes. You know, what do we want our work, our communication, our story to look like? And that's a very, you know, conscious thing that I'm always thinking about. And this region, to me, just lent itself to black and white film because I wanted to capture that timelessness. Because, again, I had this urgency, like things were changing too quickly and I was losing this kind of rich cultural heritage that I had spent so much time learning about and so much time documenting. So this man is always has a funny story to go along with him. But you can see it's a wonderful, wonderful spirit. To document life and culture in this remote and historically significant region. So this is the Silk Road. We've all heard romantic tales about the Silk Road. We've heard about religion coming from the Middle East and Chinese silk going from the East to the Middle East and eventually to Europe and things like this. And this is really where it all happened. This was the highway of trade and goods and ideas for hundreds of years. And Kashgar played such a central role in all of that. It's kind of, in many ways, sad how it's changing so rapidly. But it's also important to understand that a lot of the local people are quite keen to see their community and their, you know, surrounding environment be improved with, you know, indoor plumbing, with, you know, communication technology, with roads, which allow people to get to market easier. So all of these kinds of advancements are a double-edged sword. But the problem is that much of China is really beginning to look the same. Destruction of old neighborhoods, creation of modern cities are increasing the rate of this loss and of culture in Xinjiang, and actually minority regions throughout China. One of the problems with what we see in some of the more remote parts of China is exactly the same architecture being built in places like rural Beijing on the outskirts of the city being built in Kashgar, you know, 4,000 miles away. So there's this kind of export of cheap or not so nice looking architecture as a way of facilitating work and business. And that's becoming evident everywhere. And I have pictures of this I'll introduce you to later. As I mentioned, Xinjiang, or Chinese Turkestan, borders several countries, and this is on the border of Afghanistan and China. Afghanistan and China share a very, very small border. It's not very long, but there is a significant population of people who live near there. And this man's not Afghani, he's actually Kyrgyz. He's a Kyrgyz man, and you can tell by his hat. In this part of the world, many people wear different styles of hats to identify their ethnicity or their cultural connections. And he's a herder, and this morning when I photographed him, he was very cold. He had his hands in his jacket, trying to keep himself warm, and he was herding goats. So, and you can see the land behind him is almost moon-like, and it's actually just a high-altitude desert. And at this stage, we were above 10,000 meters, 10,000 feet. That would have been a bit strange, because Everest is only 8,000 meters. So I also set some altitude records when I made this book. But you've got me all confused now between kilometers, or meters and miles, but and feet. But yes, about 10,000 feet above we were for this one. And behind him is the famous mountain of Musta Agata, which sits right on the border with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, which is a 7,500 meter peak, which is about 23,000 feet. I don't think you can really understand a people or document people without getting into their homes. And if you really want to learn how people live and what people do, you've got to knock on doors. And this part of the world, as I mentioned before, was the Silk Road, people coming from east and west, passing through. It is some of the most hospitable people you've ever met. You can literally ruck up, knock on a door, and be invited in for food and tea. And of course, as a photographer, you live for those moments because you get a window into how people really live. And when I would do that, obviously I would make my intentions very clear that I wanted to come in and photograph and learn a little bit about how these people live. They often had courtyard homes with an open center. And in this particular case, this man was a knife maker. And behind him are his two sons, and he's training them the family tradition of how to make knives. And this part of the world is quite famous for the kind of jeweled blades that you see. And I might have a picture of that later on. But again, a very nice portrait. And again, that's natural light. You know, I don't use any kind of flashes or anything like that. And there was really a window just behind me on my right when I kind of photographed him, and I was able to use that natural light coming through to get that image. And this is what some of the cities look like in Xinjiang or Chinese Turkestan, this part of the world. And you can see the streets are kind of not yet full of cars. It hasn't quite reached the Los Angeles traffic levels. But you can see how they use the market, and the market extends into, you know, public space or roads. And this is kind of a common sight. And I actually photographed this from my favorite tea house, which was up on the second floor of this little intersection. But a nice reminder of an everyday street scene. This was in Kashgar. Here's another shot. This was in Kucha, also along the Silk Road, kind of in between Urumqi and Kashgar. And again, a night market. And this night market happens every evening at dusk. And people all flood in and they eat before they go home, and they connect with their friends. And here this man's cooking noodles and making bread. And this kind of activity occurs all the time. And it's actually not a trick light bulb, as someone pointed out in one of my previous lectures. It is actually a broken light bulb, and it just looks like that in the camera, and I really can't explain why. But it's not a floating light bulb. This one was quite nice. This was a man in his 80s who makes a meat dumpling. And what he does is it's steamed bread, and he packs in some mutton or some sheep meat, and then kind of wraps it. And the man behind him is his son, and not in this picture, but is the son's son. So we've got the youngest grandson was actually serving people, running around delivering some of the goods. So we've got 3 generations of people kind of working in one little restaurant, and people would come walking through the market and stop and pick some things up, put them in a plastic bag, and then they would kind of be off. So you could say that this is fast food in Chinese Turkestan. And one man was quite funny. He actually said to me, you know, inside this we put sheep meat. And Chinese is not very prevalent in this part of China. A lot of people speak the local dialect, which is Uyghur, which kind of sounds like Turkish. And I don't speak it, and I never was able to get a handle of it. But some of the conversations I did have with people were in Chinese, and some people would tell me that this was the Chinese, the Zhongguo Maidan Lao, and Maidan Lao is McDonald's. So they would say, like, this is the Uyghur style of McDonald's, because it was a beef like hamburger, and it was very much fast food. So that was a joke. And he had been to a part of China that had a McDonald's. He had been to, not him, but another man I was standing next to me, had been to Xi'an, which is a big industrial city in China and famous for the terracotta warriors, and has a few McDonald's, so he had been there. And notice the similarities. This man is not reaching for any kind of weapon or anything like that. He's just reaching for his wallet. Again, someone mentioned that in a previous lecture, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. And yeah, he's just reaching for his wallet to pay for some food. But I just love that sinister look, like he's in some kind of Martin Scorsese movie. But you can, I think one of the interesting things is you look at his face, and it's just so Caucasian, you know, in many ways. And there were a lot of funny moments where people would come up to me, and they would people would make jokes about these people looking quite a bit like myself, and not necessarily looking, you know, Chinese or Kazakh or Kyrgyz, but being a mix of many cultures. And you know, there were some places where you could visit in this region where the men would look downright Italian with their olive skin and actually have kind of green or blue eyes. And of course, this is all part of the same region where Steve McCurry kind of took that famous shot of that girl with the green eyes in Afghanistan, and this is all kind of the same culture and the same part of intermingling that occurred. And this is in Kucha, in a market. I usually don't do this as a photographer. I usually like to make really clean, crisp images. I usually don't use a lot of light play or shadows or silhouettes or anything like this, but this was a moment where, you know, everyone was lining up to get food in this one particular food stall, and the light was coming in so strong, and you know, you make some adjustments to the camera and you see what you can get. And this was one of those moments where I caught a young boy just kind of looking in to see what he was going to select before he paid for his food. So a funny little moment where I had to get down quite low because he was also quite short. I'm quite tall, you know, 6'3", and quite, you know, working in these areas. If you want to get a lower perspective, you've got to get very low. Love this man with all of my heart. He's also living in Kucha, and I ate at his stall many times. He makes meat dumplings and also some noodles. And I probably photographed this man 7 different times. Every time I went back to Kucha, over 8 years, I went and stopped and had lunch with him. And it was great. And I was actually sitting down eating when I took this shot because someone was yelling at him from just off kind of camera, and he looked at him kind of mean looking. And I took that picture, and always kind of reminds me of the meals we had. And again, love his facial features and his strong, kind of intense facial features, which is very prevalent of the men in the region. Again, another man making noodles. This is in Hotan in southern Xinjiang, southern Chinese Turkestan. And you can see the steam coming up out of the bowl. It's January. One of the things I like to do when I'm working on a longer term project is you have to visit in different seasons. You can't just keep going back in the summertime when it's warm. That doesn't really give you the full story. You have to be authentic in what you're doing. You need to be there in the winter. You need to be there in the heat of the summer, because the lifestyle changes, the food changes, the way people live changes, and you want to really have a broad understanding of all of those kinds of different ideas and different ways of life. So you can see just how cold it was. I was wearing a huge jacket and gloves and a hat and a scarf, but he was just hanging out actually in a short-sleeve t-shirt. Strong guys, no joke. And this one is in the dead of summer, and cantaloupe and watermelon are big sellers, especially on the streets, and this man is hawking or selling cantaloupe after the main prayer on Friday. And he's in a high traffic area in Kashgar, and kind of an example of what maybe a modern Chinese Turkestan man or Uyghur man might look like today, whereas you have this picture, which is a little bit more traditional looking, and this picture maybe even more so. But nothing is as modern as high heels. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions in the West about what we all think about women who are fully veiled. And you can just tell by this woman's posture that she's incredibly proud, and you can tell by her dress and her attention to detail, that she's quite confident. And I think that to have that image, next to a mosque, in central Kashgar, this is the Idka Mosque. This is the most popular mosque or famous mosque in all of Central Asia, which resides in central Kashgar. It's quite a nice image, and everyone notices the heels, and they're massive. And it goes to just show you that the women actually dress to their nines. They really dress up underneath, the black overcoats and the scarves around their necks, or around their heads, sorry. And I've got other images that are kind of also telling of that. But I just love this, because I watched her. This was one of a series of shots, and I photographed her, and I would run a little bit, and then photograph her again, and then would run a little bit, and tried to get that one moment where she was just dead straight and right into it, right in front of the mosque. And it was lovely. You see a lot of women like this in this part of the world. Religious festivals are also very important. This is a mainly Muslim part of the world. There are some Buddhists still hiding in the mountains, but Islam dominates. And this is again the Idka Mosque. And this is the end of Ramadan, which is a large prayer day and a large celebration. And Ramadan, of course, is daylight fasting, lasts about 1 month. And then, of course, at the end of Ramadan, there's a big party because everyone's very happy that they can eat again during daylight. And part of that is a slaughtering of sheep, and then donating the sheep meat to charity or to lesser people, or having a big kind of party and festival, which includes dancing. And much of these festivities are actually done in the Idka Square, which is where I am now. And a lot of people ask me, about this project, Chinese Turkestan, working in China, problems with the police, getting arrested, sensitive topics. And in 8 years, this was the only picture I got in trouble for, because I ran up to the roof of a nearby building because I thought I really needed to get a shot from above, because I had worked the crowd and I had worked kind of around the fringes of the festivities, being very careful not to actually be in front of someone who's praying, because that's really rude. So you have to kind of stay around the edges. But I did manage to get up onto a nearby building, and as I ran up and kicked open the door to the roof, trying not to miss the moment, there were a whole bunch of Chinese policemen there. To which they went like this. Yes. And I was like, I'm just a photographer, just trying to take some pictures. So they were actually watching the festivities up there to make sure that everything stayed orderly, and everything did. But that was the only kind of moment where I was ever kind of questioned about what I was doing and why I was in such a rush. Again, the festivities around the mosques are a hub for commerce, both selling goods and also begging. Begging is an accepted practice in much of the Muslim world. And there were always some kind of debate around whether these people were actually injured, whether they actually, had broken bones, or sometimes you would see women who were there holding up an X-ray, indicating a broken bone or something like that. And to me, I think as a photographer, as a journalist, as someone who asks questions, you're always like, is she really that hurt? But actually, most people who were coming out of the mosques, they didn't even think about it. They would just give her some money, and that was just an accepted thing to do. And when you would try to talk to people afterwards and ask them why you would, give her money, they didn't really have any idea of why they did it. They just did it because everyone else kind of was doing it. It wasn't necessarily a conscious effort, but this was very much commonplace. Love this man's hat. One of my favorites. Mustaches are very prevalent in this region as well, which is great. And this is a man who's selling a lot of cows, and it was at an animal market in a small village about an hour or two outside of Kashgar. And again, a modern-day Uyghur man, a city dweller, a man of the market. He had a mobile phone. And he's got a hat, and he looks the part. He definitely had a mobile phone and liked using it. This was the same carpet-making factory as the old man from earlier. And again, having a chance to work with people like this is just unbelievable. And working in a small room like this with people making carpets in the winter, the dead of winter, was very cold. Coming into that environment, having a chance to communicate my intentions with them. As a foreigner, obviously coming into a small room of carpet makers, people were like, "What are you doing?" And communicating with them that I'm here to take their picture, but I was going to stay for a while. And again, that kind of reoccurring theme of spending time with people, talking to people, learning about them before you pick up your camera and start photographing them, just allows them to feel comfortable with you and allows you to get that moment that we're all striving for as documentary photographers, where we're capturing people in a real natural environment, doing natural things. And yes, this is a portrait. He was looking at me, but there were other images that I captured as well where he was working, making carpets. And this is the future. And when I mentioned about Chinese, East Coast Chinese architecture being transported out into the West, this is very much what we're starting to see now. We're starting to see old laneways, one-story homes, mud brick homes in many cases, being transformed into 10-story apartment blocks. And this is the future of Chinese Turkestan. This is the future of Xinjiang province. But even if they start building high-rises, this man will still probably climb up to the top of the mosque every day and scream at the top of his lungs to get people in. And a funny story here, I actually had to sign a waiver, which I wrote down on a napkin in English, that if I fell off the top of that very small ledge, that I would not hold the mosque accountable. And he was very strict about that. And that platform is wide, but it's not that wide because it was quite a big drop and quite scary when you're looking through a rangefinder lens and trying to figure out where that edge might be as he walks back and forth. But a lovely picture, and again, just photographing and looking at the traditions that still exist in this part of the world. This is an example of some of the old laneways in central Kashgar. These kind of mud brick homes, they're usually made with stacks of brick, and then on the outside of the brick, they use wet mud that then dries and protects the brick. And this is the way people have been building homes in this region for hundreds of years. And you can see here where some parts of the mud have broken away and the brick is exposed. You can't visit this part of the world without a good sheep slaughtering, and that man is holding a large intestine. That is not a rope. That is a carcass of a sheep. And this is, again, for the festival of the end of Ramadan. And you can see the kids looking on, and you can actually, if you look close enough, if it shows the steam coming off of the carcass, again, in winter. And these kinds of street butcherings and then distribution of meat is part of the festivities that go along with the end of Ramadan. A classic example of the maze of old laneways that exist through many of the kind of historic old towns of these cities. And you can see how close the homes are together and the kind of old doors. And it's really lovely. And not a sight that you can see so much anymore. Again, another fully veiled woman, completely covered face, and again with massive high heels, just strutting, really. I mean, a picture tells 1,000 words, but it doesn't show you really the way she struts through the crowd. Very interesting. Here, we've got two older women fully veiled, and walking past some very kind of old phones, old little phone bank there where people would come and make phone calls to local friends or family. Obviously, this is a real dated picture. I think it was one of the first pictures I took in 2003 or 2004 before mobile phones became very prevalent. And now these kinds of scenes don't exist. You would never see a bank of phones sitting in front of a small shop like that because they're completely gone. Women without scarves over their faces, there's many of them, and they're very open and very welcoming and trying to document and understand their way of life as mothers and as wives and as daughters was always very important. So spending time photographing them and kind of speaking to them about their lives was an important part of this project as well. I would constantly, as I said, just walk up buildings and knock on doors and things like that, and where you might hear stories about places in Afghanistan or Pakistan or other places of majority Muslim culture or Islam being kind of dangerous. I would say that this part of China is really quite accepting of guests or foreign visitors like myself, to the point where, I would just randomly walk around and knock on people's doors and, ask if I can come in and photograph them and have tea with them, and was very accepted in every place I went. Very lucky in many ways. Here's some people building. Parts of Kashgar now are being redeveloped, and these are some people who are rebuilding some homes in central Kashgar. And of course, all those bricks have to come from somewhere, and brick kilns or brick-making factories are very prevalent in this region, and it's very, very hard work. And you can see that this man here is hauling a huge trolley of wet bricks, and they'll be stacked and then put into the kiln later and then shipped out. And here you can see a woman working, lifting rows of bricks, wet bricks, one after another, and stacking them day after day. And this was one of the truck drivers that would then take the finished bricks and drive them into the city to be used for various construction projects. As I mentioned, the markets are a big deal, and in the cities now, the cities have become so busy with cars and traffic that many of the market goers actually have to wait in holding areas like this dry riverbed. Early in the morning, they'll even come in the day before the market and sleep in the dry riverbed on their donkey carts or on the floor, and then wait to go to the market the next day. And this is just amazing to see this dry riverbed full of people, all waiting to go to the nearby market. These men are not twins. They appeared not to know each other, but I did follow them for quite a while. I love the beards. I love the facial hair. I love the expression. The older generation just have so much dignity and have so much confidence in the way they move, the way they walk, the way they conduct business, and are quite elegant, and always try to capture them in some way, shape, or form. Of course, making the trade for some sheep, money in hand, one man buying another man's sheep, always trying to capture this moment of transaction. Again, more men buying sheep. The markets are just such a hub of activity. It's really just impossible not to enjoy documenting this. And people would come in with truckloads of sheep and offload the sheep in not the most humane way. That man is holding a sheep and he's about to toss it off the truck to another man who will catch it and then put it on the ground, but he missed a few times. But you can see just the amount of livestock that's there. Here's another young boy. Again, it's a family business. A lot of young children, whether they're done school or not in school. There are varying situations, but they're helping offload some sheep and get them into the market. This is the original Marlboro man for this part of the region. He's a hired gun. He's a hired gun. He's a man who drives a truck. He doesn't own the sheep, but he drives the truck and helps transport the sheep. And and when he's done his job, he sits back and lights up, and will sit there all day waiting. And then any unsold sheep will go back on the truck, and then back to whichever village he came from. And he'll just sit there quite coolly and enjoy a few cigarettes. And you can see just the crowd below him. I mean, it's just chaos. I did have my feet stepped on by several cows. Again, trying to get close to people with a 28 millimeter lens. I used Leica rangefinders with a 50 millimeter and a 28 millimeter lens. Really enjoyed kind of getting into these moments where things were happening, get quite close to people, and try to capture layers of action and faces. And I always think that kind of can add a nice element to an image. And here as well, a man counting off some money in another trade. Cockfighting is big in this part of the world. Gambling is big in this part of the world, and I was very lucky to attend a cockfight and photograph it. They rarely happen, and when they do, they happen in secrecy. And I was very lucky to actually have a chance to visit and to get right in, and actually to stand where I'm standing. That's the high rollers area. You've got to lay down some big money to get in and be able to sit on the dirt. So all those guys in the first row, those are the big spenders, and all the guys in the cheap seats are contributing less to the action. But the owners of the little stadium were quite nice and let me get right in. And the big spenders and the big guns, the whales, I think they're as they're called, my Ocean's 11 terminology, love to check, the roosters before the fight. They'll check the neck skin to make sure it's tough, because that's where a lot of the scratching happens, in around the neck, and that's where a lot of the death and the bleeding out happens. It's quite violent, it's quite vicious, but you can tell by this man's eyes that he is taking it seriously. And it's great to kind of learn about this part of the culture, as inhumane as it might be. I've never seen a young boy whip a donkey quite like this. His father's even trying to stop him from whipping the donkey so much. So this is, at the end of the day, people are now leaving the market. They've sold everything that they've come to sell, and people are heading out with empty donkey carts. And this man was obviously letting his boy do the steering. And this kid's like 5 years old, and he's just wailing away on the donkey with the whip. And I almost got hit. But it was quite an interesting moment, father-son moment, I suppose. This man is actually testing out a horse that he is interested in purchasing. And what they do is they come to this laneway just off the market, and they'll ride the horse up and down that little path as a way of kind of testing it out. And again, quite a nice little moment showing kind of how animals are traded between people. This is a blacksmith working in his courtyard in central Kashgar, and gives you an idea of the mud brick homes and kind of the lifestyle and existence of some people. It's a young woman who's, again, making a carpet, working in a carpet factory. It's a very elderly woman working in a carpet factory. Again, in the winter, she farms in the summer. And I just love the way she was sitting in the window light in the early morning, and she was actually sitting there because that's the warmest of all of the looms, because it's right next to the window and it gets the early morning light. So a lot of the younger boys and the men were working in dark corners, but they let her take the one next to the sun, and she was in her 60s, I believe. But it was quite nice with the light. Shoemaking, shoe repair is big business, and people don't replace their shoes quite as often as we do here in the Western world, so shoe repair is active, and always love the faces on the people watching the guy fixing the shoes, and he's got his own little crowd there. Two young boys learning the knife-making tradition. Again, this is the same image I showed earlier, where the father was standing in front of them, and this kind of tradition of passing down skills like this from one generation to the next is starting to really die out. Two young girls working in that same carpet factory. This is one of the more interesting ones. This woman goes to the market and purchases sheep heads of sheep, just the head. She brings them back to her home and burns off the hair and dehydrates the meat using that massive flame. And that's a way of preserving the sheep meat in the face and the neck of the sheep, which is the most tender or the most valuable. And then she then takes the sheep heads back to market and sells them as preserved sheep meat. And that's her job. And she does this in her home. And again, this was just a random door that I knocked on and was invited in with open arms. But after a while, I was kind of concerned about what I'd stumbled into, because you can see there's sheep body parts everywhere. And the smell was really unbelievable. And the fact that this woman's doing this in her home and has been for decades, really, just to make a living. This man is a blacksmith, and this is his workshop, and always trying to capture portraits and interesting faces along the journey. A lot of people think that Chinese Turkestan is one big desert, and as I showed you before, the central part is a massive desert, but surrounding that desert is actually mountain ranges, and in those mountain ranges are glaciers and ice, and that ice melts into rivers, and the surrounding area around the desert is actually very good farming land because of irrigation. And here you can see how irrigation plays a role in helping the local community and having a community of farmers. Cotton is big in this part of the world as well. This young girl is picking cotton on the border, near the border with Kyrgyzstan and China. And this man is digging an irrigation ditch on his farm. This woman comes with quite a story. You almost never see a woman of this age working in the farm, working the land. And any woman who is working the land at this age, in her 70s really, has quite a story to tell. So her and her husband had 3 daughters. And when you have 3 daughters, they grow up and they get married, and the daughters go to the husband's home and help the husband's family. And so she lost her daughters to their husbands' families, and now she and her husband have to take care of their own farm because she didn't have a husband or a son. So a son would have stayed with their family, and then their kids and his wife would have worked on their farm. But because she had 3 daughters, she'd lost kind of her help and the people that were supposed to support her and take care of her as she got older. So you almost never see anyone of this age working in the fields, and she was kind of upset about it when we started talking about how difficult her life now is because she had 3 daughters. And you can see the kind of extreme nature that can exist when having kind of discussions about gender in parts of the world where people live in not the nicest conditions.
What are they growing?
That is different kinds of cabbage and some rice. They even can grow rice there because they've got so much water. So they'll grow some rice, which they use. Lots of cabbage, lots of veggies. Veggies fetch a higher price, so they're big on vegetables. Here's an old man again walking out into the fields with a large axe. Young woman picking cotton with baby in hand. Again, there's no housekeepers or things like that, so people take their kids out into the field and work with them. And just loved this lady. She was in a really small village near the border of Kazakhstan and China, and had a chance to kind of spend some time with her and her sister and her husband, who were all working together. And she had this little baby and managed to just work seamlessly with the baby without losing a beat. People in this part of the world still have to go to the river to collect water. So you can see this woman is balancing 2 large containers of fresh water from a nearby river, which comes straight out of the glaciers of the nearby mountains. This was a very interesting moment where just outside of Hotan, a large portion of people went out to pray into the desert, and there is a desert mosque for one of the imams that brought Islam to this part of the world. And people still go out once a year, actually on a regular basis, but there's a big crowd once a year, and they go out and pray in the middle of the desert. And this was one of the toughest days I spent as a photographer in this part of the world, because we got caught in a big sandstorm and we had to go out into the middle of nowhere, really, where we got caught up in a lot of the natural elements. And the wind was just incredible. And here you can see part of the religious process that these people go through is to bury themselves in the sand, which they kind of value as being holy. And that's his wife laying next to him, and she's actually laying down. She's not fully covered. But again, it's a family ordeal, people bringing young babies out into the fields, out into the deserts. This was an interesting image we met this woman as I entered the cemetery. This is a cemetery in a small village just outside of Kashgar. And I met this woman when she came into the cemetery, and we started chatting with her a little bit, and turns out that her husband had recently passed, and she was going to pray at her husband's burial site, which is where she is at this moment. And we asked if we could, follow her and talk a little bit more about her, and maybe even photograph if that was acceptable. And she said fine. And this was the image I got from that moment. And yeah, it's a lot of people go to the cemetery on Friday after the main prayer and pay respects to their family members who have passed away. 2 women on the border of Pakistan and China, on the China side, also collecting water from a glacial river. And this is one moment actually where I wish I had a color film, because both of these women had the most stunning green eyes you'd ever seen, which didn't get captured in black and white. Camel caravan. This man was leading a camel caravan up into the mountains. He was heading back to his village from the main road where we found him. The woman collecting camel dung and donkey dung on a high plateau, which she'll then take back to her home and use for fuel. This is an example of some of the barren landscape that you'll find along the borders of Chinese Turkestan and China and Pakistan. There are some camels in the region, and that's in a dry glacial bed, glacial riverbed. This man is walking. This was the man who I said earlier had his hands in his jacket in the cold morning, walking with his sheep. An older knife maker working at his home. Again, farming in the summertime and making knives in the winter. This was one of those Mongolian men that I had found up in the mountains, and it had just started snowing, and he was on horseback riding straight into a blizzard. Very strange, one day you're in the desert and you're boiling hot, and the next time you drive 2 days up into the mountains and you see stuff like this. Shows kind of the diversity of the region. Again, you've got desert-like landscapes covered with, surrounded by snow-capped peaks. Woman walking through the desert on part of that religious trek. Men playing chess in central Kashgar. This region is really a leisure region. To say they don't like to work too much would be kind of an understatement. They like to hang out. And that's one of the cultural differences with a lot of the Eastern Chinese immigrants that are coming in and really looking for fortune and looking to work hard and do lots of things. And this is one of the cultural elements that's causing so much friction, because the men would just like to hang out and drink tea and play chess all day. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all again very much for sitting through that. And
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And just so you guys know, we do have Mr. Pyle's book for sale on this presentation, which he will be signing afterwards as well. So that leads us to the question and portion answer for the evening. So before we get started, I would like to give you a few guidelines on how we run our Q&A here. There will be 2 staff members with microphones, myself and Heather to my left. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If your question is selected, please make your way to the nearest aisle so that we don't have to reach over your neighbors. Also, we are recording this, so we ask you that you please speak clearly into the microphone. In order to help you do this, we will hold the microphone for you. So let's get started. Any questions? Front right.
Thank you, first of all, for a great presentation. That was wonderful. Are there any nomadic traditions in the area, or are the populations pretty stationary?
excellent question. So there are some nomadic traditions in the area. Traditionally, there had always been city dwellers who operated the markets, who dealt with travelers coming in and out, but there had always been people living out in the countryside. Also in small villages, some people were semi-nomadic, maybe like seasonal, where they would take herds off in the summertime and then come back to a farm in the winter or something like that. But these days, there's very few nomadic traditions in China. It was very hard to find anyone who'd spent 12 months a year without a home, constantly moving. That's definitely not the case these days. A lot of people now have migrated to the cities because they want their children to have a better education and have better kind of work opportunities. And that's kind of where the development is taking these kind of rural regions, putting so much pressure financially on the families that they now need to worry about education and getting good jobs and things like that. Yeah.
Next question, left back.
Hi, thanks for that great presentation. So at 6'3" and blondish and Caucasian, you really blended in. Right.
I did, yes.
Could you speak a little bit about how you were received being so standout and how you were able to befriend these people to shoot with them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, that you have to do at any time is just spend time with people and not be in a rush. And I think that if you sit around in a tea house for an hour drinking tea with people and everyone can kind of get used to you and who you are and the fact that you're there, then when you start taking pictures of them and having kind of small conversations with them, it's all very relaxed. Because they've seen you there, they've kind of gotten used to you, you've become a fly on the wall. And then you can start, working and trying to capture real life. Whereas if you kind of kick the door open and walk in and be like, I got to be out of here in 5 minutes, and you just start running through, you're going to offset everything that these people are doing. And my only goal to be there is to not be there and to try to just document some moment of truth. And that's really what I was going for. And the other part of that is a lot of times when I went, I actually let my beard grow out. And actually a lot of people thought I was Russian. Because this part of China borders with Russia and Kazakhstan, so you get a lot of Caucasian Russians coming through doing a lot of trade. So a lot of people thought I might have been Russian, and then they were quite happy when I said I was Canadian. So that went over quite well.
Next question, front right.
Were you able to engage anyone about the Uyghur Chinese government conflict when you were there, have any conversations with them, or even observe any of what was going on there?
Yeah, I think, at no point in my documentation did I ever witness like a riot or any act of violence. That was never the case, and that was also never part of my story. I very much wanted to document this way of life that I felt was disappearing, and I didn't want to include that aspect of it, so I never went looking for it. But of course, when you spend time with people, everyone talks. And I can let you know that, there is a lot of bitterness in this region, and race and ethnicity plays a card in what school your child goes to, how much you earn, how much you had to pay for your taxi license, how much tax you pay for your restaurant versus someone else, who has this connection, who has that connection. But with that being said, one of the most enlightening moments while I was working was I was photographing this vegetable farm. And the owner of the farm was kind of working in the fields, and he was talking with my assistant who was local. And he was saying, how he hates the local government. I hate the local government. They're so corrupt. They're bastards, They make us buy all this stuff we don't need. They make us buy this fertilizer. It's too expensive and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, wow, he's really upset. And I go, is the local, where's the local government from? He goes, oh, the local government are local Uyghur people. So this just, this is this concept that kind of washed over me. It's like, it doesn't matter who's in power. A lot of the people in this region, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you're a Uyghur in power over a village, they were doing not so nice things to each other, but there was no race card to play. And then, the Chinese government leaders in that region do pretty much the same thing, but of course it raises a lot more anger and frustration. So that was an interesting moment.
Next question, left back.
I noticed in a number of your photos that there was a line of trees in the background, which really gave a nice, almost framing aspect. But are they that prevalent? Are they windbreaks? Are they boundary lines or something?
Absolutely. So they would be boundary lines between farms. So that region might have had lots of trees at one stage, and then they would have been cut down in order to irrigate and farm those areas. So what you get is in those farming areas, a lot of people use trees as boundaries between properties. And I agree, they look really lovely, and with that kind of coal haze that you get in the morning and stuff like that. It adds a really nice backdrop.
So this will be the last question of the evening, front right.
Oh.
Thanks. I was wondering, during the time you've been traveling there, if it's been long enough, have you noticed a difference in how number of women wearing the full scarf and the full cover? Have there been more as the years have gone on, or about the same?
Less. So this region is modernizing incredibly quickly. And whether it's the Chinese government not wanting them to do that, which is also part of the case, they've banned full face covering in this region. That's also leading to that. But also a lot of the people are less strict with regards to their Islam faith than they might have been 20, 30 years ago. And there's a lot of kind of much less fully covered women. So that's it's definitely a trend that's on the way out in many cases. But even the fully covered women still wear pretty rockin' high heels and walk with a great step. It's unbelievable, in most places in the world when you see a fully veiled woman, you don't necessarily see that kind of pride and that straight back and the way they walk. But anyways, I had very unique experiences in this part of China. So I think that's it. And that was very...
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much.